The world was not prepared for the storm that was about to hit. It began in the most unexpected way. An experiment gone wrong. A small isolated lab had been experimenting with genetic mutations, hoping to create a virus that could strengthen the human body and fight off diseases. What they didn't expect was the disaster that followed. The virus, designed to help humanity, mutated faster than they could control it. It spread from one person to another, quicker than anyone had anticipated. At first, people didn't think much of it. They were told it was just another flu-like virus that would come and go. But as days passed, it became clear that this was something far worse. Hospitals around the world began to fill up with patients showing strange symptoms. The usual treatments didn't work, and doctors were left confused and scared. People who had caught the virus started to act differently. They didn't show the usual signs of sickness, no high fevers or coughs. Instead, they seemed stronger, more alert. Their eyes glowed in a way that couldn't be explained, and their bodies looked like they were changing, adapting, evolving. As the virus spread, cities began to panic. Governments issued lockdowns, trying to stop the virus from spreading, but it was already too late. The virus was not only infecting people, it was changing them. Some people felt a surge of energy, a new sense of power they had never known before. Others, however, began to lose control, becoming aggressive and violent. News outlets reported bizarre attacks, where infected individuals showed strength and speed that was impossible for a normal human. Videos of these attacks went viral, and fear spread just as quickly as the virus. But the most terrifying part wasn't the violence. It was the silence that followed. As days turned into weeks, those who had been infected began to disappear from hospitals and quarantine zones. They weren't dying. They were simply leaving. Infected people started to gather in small groups, moving away from the cities, venturing into the wilderness, and the world had no idea why. Was the virus killing them slowly, or were they becoming something else entirely? Scientists and world leaders were scrambling for answers. A special task force was formed to study the virus, but no one could understand its true nature. The virus didn't behave like any known disease. It didn't destroy the human body. It didn't turn people into mindless zombies. Instead, it seemed to empower them. The more scientists studied it, the more questions they had. The infected humans didn't seem sick at all. They seemed stronger, smarter, faster. One scientist, Dr. Elena Voss, had been part of the original research team that created the virus. She was determined to find out what was happening, even if it meant going against everything she had once believed. She had seen the virus effects firsthand, but even she couldn't explain how or why the infected humans were changing so dramatically. It was as if the virus was pushing humanity to evolve, and no one could stop it. Dr. Voss made a bold decision to investigate further. She secretly met with a small group of infected individuals who had gathered on the outskirts of a remote town. These were not the violent, uncontrollable mutants shown on TV. Instead, they were calm, almost peaceful, as if they had embraced their new reality. They weren't the monsters everyone feared. They were different. But different didn't always mean dangerous, did it? As Dr. Voss observed them, she noticed something that left her speechless. Their eyes, once filled with confusion and fear, now looked clear and focused. Their bodies, once weak and frail, were now strong and lithe. It was as if the virus had stripped away all the flaws and weaknesses of human biology. The virus had made them better. But at what cost? The more Dr. Voss learned, the more questions she had. If this virus could make humans stronger and smarter, what else could it do? And was humanity ready for the changes that were already happening? Some of the infected had begun to develop abilities that seemed impossible. One man could manipulate electrical devices with just his mind. Another woman could move at speeds faster than a human could comprehend. The world had only begun to see the tip of the iceberg, and Dr. Voss knew that the virus was evolving faster than anyone could track. The governments of the world were in chaos. Leaders tried to calm the public, but they were no longer in control. Panic spread faster than the virus itself. People were torn between fear and curiosity. Some begged for a cure, hoping to return to normal, while others saw the virus as a blessing, a chance to step into a new era of human evolution. The media played a dangerous game, spreading misinformation, making the situation even worse. People were divided, and no one knew who to trust. Dr. Voss couldn't ignore the growing feeling that something more was at play. The virus had become an unstoppable force, a wild animal that couldn't be tamed. The infected were changing too quickly, and there was no way to predict what the next step would be. Would they continue to evolve, growing into something entirely new, or would they destroy the world they had once known? One thing was certain: humanity had reached a crossroads. The path forward would be dangerous, uncertain, and irreversible. As the days passed, more and more infected humans began to disappear into the wilderness. They weren't dying. They were becoming something else, something beyond human comprehension. Dr. Voss tried to follow their trail, hoping to understand where they were going and what they were becoming, but it was like chasing ghosts. They were always one step ahead, moving quickly, silently, as if they were no longer bound by the limitations of human existence. The world was in chaos. Some governments tried to contain the virus with extreme measures, creating quarantine zones and lockdowns, but they couldn't stop the spread. Others, more desperate, began to see the virus as the next step in human evolution, something to be embraced rather than feared. As the virus continued to spread, one thing became clear: the world as it had been known was ending, and something entirely new, something far more dangerous, was rising in its place. Infected humans were not just surviving. They were thriving. And the rest of humanity? They were left in the dark, watching as the world they once knew crumbled away. The virus had unlocked something in the human genome, something that couldn't be put back into a bottle. The question was no longer whether a cure would be found, but whether humanity would be able to adapt to the new world that was emerging. The first wave of infected humans had disappeared, but they weren't gone. They were evolving. And in the distance, the world could hear the faint sound of something growing, something that would soon change the world forever. The virus wasn't just a plague. It was the future of humanity. And there was no turning back. As the virus continued to spread, the world began to realize that it was no longer just a threat. It was a harbinger of something entirely new. People were no longer just being infected. They were transforming into something beyond human comprehension. The once fearful virus was now seen by some as a gift. They weren't dying or turning into mindless beasts. They were evolving into something stronger, more capable. These were not the mutations of horror stories. They were the beginning of a new chapter in human evolution. Scientists, who had initially been terrified of the virus, started to change their perspectives. A select few, including Dr. Voss, began to understand that the virus wasn't simply mutating the human body. It was enhancing it. It was refining the weaknesses that had plagued humanity for centuries. Those who had embraced the virus started to show abilities that were nothing short of miraculous. The first few cases were small: a person who could heal faster, one who could sense other people's emotions, another who could communicate with technology as though it were an extension of themselves. These new abilities were both awe-inspiring and terrifying, and they made the rest of the world question whether the future of humanity had arrived. People began to call them the enhanced, though the term didn't quite fit. These individuals were not merely stronger or smarter. They were becoming something completely different. They no longer feared the virus. They welcomed it. The very thing that had spread panic and chaos across the world was now the key to their survival. And they weren't keeping it a secret. Soon, social media was flooded with videos of the enhanced performing extraordinary feats. Some could run faster than the eye could see, others could bend metal with their bare hands, and some could move objects without touching them. The world was watching in awe, but not everyone was excited about this sudden change. Governments, who had already struggled to contain the virus, found themselves at a crossroads. While some leaders saw the potential in these new humans, others feared them. A new type of human being, stronger, smarter, more capable, was rising, and no one knew what that meant for the rest of humanity. The divide between the infected and uninfected grew wider by the day. While many people still clung to the hope that a cure could be found, others saw the virus as the beginning of a golden age. They viewed the enhanced as the future of mankind, but not everyone agreed. A growing number of humans, frightened by what was happening, began to resist. They saw the virus as a plague, a sign of humanity's downfall. To them, the enhanced were dangerous, and they feared that the world they once knew was being torn apart. Protests broke out in the streets, and cities began to fracture. There was no middle ground, no place for peaceful negotiation. The world was divided. In the midst of this chaos, the enhanced began to form their own communities. They no longer trusted the old world, with its outdated systems and governments. They had seen what they could become, and they believed that the future of humanity lay in their hands. They were stronger, faster, and smarter than anyone else, and they weren't interested in returning to the old ways. They sought to build a new society, one that embraced their abilities, and they were willing to do whatever it took to protect their new world from the uninfected. Dr. Voss watched all of this unfold with a mixture of awe and concern. She had spent years researching the virus, and now she was seeing the fruits of her work in action. The virus was pushing humanity to evolve, to adapt in ways that had never been imagined. The enhanced were beginning to understand the virus in ways no one else could. They were communicating with each other through shared experiences, accessing information almost as though it were instinctive. The virus had unlocked something deep within their DNA, a connection to each other, to the world around them, that had never existed before. The more Dr. Voss studied them, the more she realized that the virus was more than just a mutation. It was a key, a doorway to a future that was beyond human comprehension. She couldn't help but wonder if the virus was part of some larger plan, a natural progression for humanity, or if it was something more sinister. Was this truly evolution, or was humanity being led down a dangerous path? The virus was changing everything, and no one knew where it would stop. As the enhanced became more organized, their abilities began to grow even more powerful. They weren't just stronger physically, they were mentally sharper as well. They could process information faster than anyone had thought possible, and they began to use their abilities to reshape the world around them. Governments and military forces tried to fight back, but they were no match for the enhanced. Tanks and guns were useless against people who could move at the speed of light or bend steel with their minds. The world watched in fear as these new humans began to dominate. People who had once been just like everyone else were now capable of feats that seemed straight out of science fiction. They could heal wounds with a touch, read minds, and control the elements. They had become gods among men, and they knew it. As they continued to grow in power, the uninfected began to question their place in this new world. Would they be left behind, living in fear of what the enhanced might do next? Or could they find a way to adapt and live alongside these new humans? The world was changing faster than anyone could keep up with, and no one knew if the future would be one of coexistence or conflict. As the enhanced began to forge their own path, there were whispers of a new leader emerging from among them. This leader was different, someone who could unite the enhanced under a single cause, someone who could push humanity forward into a new age. But who would this leader be? No one knew. All they knew was that the virus had awakened something inside humanity that could never be put back to sleep. And as the world held its breath, the future seemed uncertain, with only one thing for certain. The age of the enhanced had begun. As the weeks passed, the world began to divide into two distinct groups, the enhanced and the uninfected. What had started as a mysterious virus had now become a full-scale transformation, not just of individuals, but of entire societies. The enhanced, now aware of their extraordinary abilities, had begun to form their own communities, secluded from the uninfected world. They weren't hiding in fear, though. They were building something different from the world that existed before. A new order, one that was based on their enhanced abilities and the new reality they were creating. In these new communities, the enhanced began to develop their own code of conduct, a way of life that was different from what humanity had known. Their leaders were not elected by votes or appointed by governments, but were chosen based on their abilities, their strength, and their wisdom. These were not ordinary humans. They were the next step in human evolution, and they understood that their place in the world was no longer just to survive, but to lead. Dr. Voss, still deeply involved in studying the virus and its effects, found herself more conflicted than ever. She had spent years researching the virus, hoping to unlock its potential for the benefit of humanity. But now that potential was being realized in ways she had never imagined. The enhanced were no longer just victims of a disease. They were thriving. They were stronger, faster, and more capable than anyone could have predicted. And they were beginning to see themselves as superior to the uninfected. The uninfected, meanwhile, were struggling to keep up. Fear and anger were beginning to grow among the general population. Those who were not infected, those who had not embraced the virus, were starting to feel left behind. They watched in disbelief as the enhanced gained more power, more abilities, and more influence, while the enhanced were creating their own society, a utopia built on their newfound strength. The uninfected world was crumbling. Governments that once seemed unshakable began to fall apart. The economy was in free fall, and law and order were slowly being replaced with fear and chaos. It wasn't long before the first major conflict broke out. A group of uninfected citizens, fearing the rise of the enhanced, organized themselves into a resistance. They called themselves the Old World Order, a group that believed humanity should remain the same, that the virus was a curse rather than a gift. They saw the enhanced as a threat to their very existence, and they were willing to do anything to stop them. The Old World Order was a mix of military leaders, scientists, and ordinary citizens who felt that the virus was a mistake, a genetic aberration that needed to be stopped before it could destroy everything. The first skirmishes between the enhanced and the Old World Order were small clashes in the streets, protests that turned violent, and military units sent to confront the enhanced. But these were only the beginning. As the enhanced grew in power and numbers, the Old World Order began to escalate their attacks, launching covert operations to infiltrate the enhanced communities and sabotage their efforts. They couldn't understand what the enhanced were becoming, but they were determined to stop it, no matter the cost. But the enhanced were not to be underestimated. Their powers had grown beyond anything the Old World Order could have predicted. They no longer fought with traditional weapons. They fought with the mind, with their abilities to control the elements, to bend technology to their will, to heal wounds with a touch. They were faster than any soldier, smarter than any strategist. The Old World Order's attacks were futile in comparison. It was as though they were fighting against something far beyond human understanding. As the conflict intensified, a new leader emerged among the enhanced. His name was Kale, a man whose abilities seemed to be far beyond anything anyone had ever seen before. Kale could control not just the physical world, but the very fabric of reality itself. He could read minds, communicate telepathically with his followers, and even manipulate time, bending it to his will. Under his leadership, the enhanced became more unified, more organized, and more determined to protect their new world. Cal's rise to power was not without controversy. Some of the enhanced didn't agree with his methods, believing that their new society should be built on a foundation of peace and understanding, rather than domination. They feared that Cal's vision of the future was one where the enhanced ruled over the uninfected, and the rest of humanity would be left behind. There was growing dissent within the enhanced community, but Cal's supporters were powerful, and they believed that his vision was the only way forward. Meanwhile, the Old World Order continued to fight back, growing more desperate with each passing day. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for control, for the future of humanity. They believed that if the enhanced were allowed to continue to grow in power, They would eventually become gods, ruling over the uninfected and leaving the rest of humanity in the dust. But as the battle raged on, something unexpected happened. The uninfected world began to see that the enhanced were not just a threat. They were the future. As the enhanced shared their knowledge and abilities with the world, they began to change minds. Some of the uninfected humans, seeing the power and potential of the enhanced, began to join their cause. They no longer saw the virus as a curse, but as an opportunity to evolve, to become something greater than they had ever imagined. But there were still many who resisted. The fear of the unknown, the fear of losing everything they had known, was too strong to overcome. The conflict continued, with no end in sight. As the two factions clashed, the world seemed to be on the brink of collapse. Dr. Voss, watching all of this unfold, realized that the true question was no longer about whether the virus could be stopped. It was about what humanity was going to do with the power that the virus had unlocked. Could they coexist, the enhanced and the uninfected, or was the divide too great to bridge? Would the enhanced truly lead humanity into a new age, or would they become the very thing they had once feared? The world was standing at a crossroads, and no one knew what the future would hold. What was clear, however, was that humanity had changed forever. The virus had unlocked something deep within them, a power that could not be undone. Now it was up to them to decide whether that power would bring about the destruction of the world or its salvation. The final outcome was still uncertain, and as the battle continued, the world held its breath, waiting to see what would come next. The world was unraveling faster than anyone could have predicted. The conflict between the enhanced and the uninfected had reached a breaking point, and the world's governments were scrambling to maintain control. It was no longer just a matter of a new virus. It had become a war over the future of humanity itself. On one side, there were the enhanced, a new breed of humans who had embraced their extraordinary abilities, and on the other, the uninfected, who were determined to hold on to the old ways of life, refusing to accept the changes that the virus had brought. As the battles between the two factions grew more intense, Cal's leadership became even more influential. His powers were unlike anything anyone had ever seen before, and under his guidance, the enhanced began to move with a sense of purpose, uniting under a single cause: to create a world where their new abilities were not seen as a threat, but as the key to human progress. Cal's vision was one where the enhanced led humanity into a new age of enlightenment, one where their strength, intelligence, and abilities would be used to reshape the world. He believed that the uninfected, while not entirely useless, were holding humanity back. They were too bound by their old ways, too afraid of the potential that the virus had unlocked. To Cal, the future was clear. Only the enhanced could lead the way forward. But not everyone agreed with Cal's vision. There were those among the enhanced who still believed in a more peaceful, cooperative future. They argued that the virus had not been meant to create a divide, but to enhance humanity as a whole. They didn't want to dominate the uninfected. They wanted to work alongside them, building a society where both the enhanced and the uninfected could thrive. These dissenters feared that Cal's growing power would lead to a dictatorship, one where the enhanced would become tyrants, ruling over the rest of humanity with an iron fist. They believed that the virus had the potential to bring about a new world order, but only if it was embraced by everyone, not just by those who had mutated. In the midst of this internal struggle, the old world order, led by the uninfected resistance, continued to gain strength. Their members had grown more organized, more determined to stop the enhanced from taking over. They had seen the power that the enhanced possessed, and they feared that if left unchecked, these new humans would eventually destroy everything they held dear. The old world order launched more aggressive attacks, using every resource at their disposal to infiltrate enhanced communities and sabotage their efforts. They had no interest in negotiating or compromising. They wanted to eradicate the virus, to return humanity to its original form, free from the influence of the mutation that had begun to tear society apart. As the war raged on, The world's population was divided like never before. Cities were reduced to battlegrounds, and entire regions were devastated by the ongoing conflict. The media played a dangerous role, fueling the fire of hatred and fear between the two sides. Every news report seemed to amplify the fear of the enhanced, portraying them as dangerous mutants, while others painted them as the saviors of humanity. The truth was hard to come by, and no one seemed to know who to trust anymore. The world was fractured, its future uncertain. In the midst of this chaos, Dr. Elena Voss, the scientist who had once been part of the team that created the virus, found herself torn between her loyalty to the enhanced and her deep fear of what the world was becoming. She had seen the potential of the virus firsthand, but she also knew the dangers it posed. The changes that the virus had triggered were irreversible, and while some of the enhanced used their powers for good, others had begun to show a darker side. Cal's power, in particular, was growing more and more unsettling. His abilities were pushing the boundaries of what was humanly possible, and his influence over the enhanced was undeniable. It was clear that he believed in the superiority of his kind, and he was willing to do whatever it took to ensure that the enhanced would reign over the uninfected. Dr. Voss knew that the world was on the brink of a tipping point. The question was no longer whether humanity could survive the virus. It was whether humanity could survive itself. Could the enhanced and the uninfected learn to coexist, or was the divide too great to bridge? Could Cal's vision of a new world order be realized without destroying everything that had come before? And most importantly, could Dr. Voss continue to support the enhanced when she feared that their powers were being used for domination rather than unity? As she struggled with these questions, a devastating blow struck the uninfected resistance. The old world order had launched a final desperate assault on one of the largest enhanced strongholds, hoping to cripple their leadership and send a message that the uninfected would not back down. It was a move that would have far-reaching consequences. The battle was fierce, and for the first time, the enhanced were forced to fight back with everything they had. Cal, leading the charge, unleashed the full extent of his powers, tearing through the enemy lines with terrifying ease. The resistance was decimated in hours, and the old world order's forces were left shattered and broken. But the victory came at a cost. As Cal stood victorious amidst the ruins, something shifted within him. He had won the battle, but he knew that the war was far from over. The uninfected would not simply fade into the background. They would continue to fight, to resist, and to try to take back what they had lost. And as Cal looked out over the battlefield, he realized that his vision for the future was more complicated than he had once thought. He was no longer fighting just for the enhanced. He was fighting for the survival of his new world, one that he now understood might require more than just strength and power to succeed. It would require unity, understanding, and perhaps even forgiveness. The enhanced were not the only ones who had changed. The uninfected, too, had evolved in ways that no one could have predicted. They had been forced to adapt, to find new ways of fighting back, and in doing so, they had become stronger, more resourceful. The virus, while still a curse to many, had also given them a new sense of purpose, a new reason to fight for survival. The world had been forever altered by the virus, but it was unclear whether this change would lead to salvation or destruction. As the battle continued, Dr. Voss realized that the future was no longer in her hands. The virus had unleashed something in humanity that no one could control, not even the enhanced. The world was changing, and no one knew what would come next. The only certainty was that the struggle for the future of humanity was far from over. The fate of the world now rested on the decisions of two sides that were growing further apart with every passing day. The enhanced had the power, but the uninfected had the will to fight, and as the battle continued, it became clear that there would be no easy resolution. Both sides had too much to lose. The question remained, would they ever find a way to coexist, or would their war destroy the world they once knew? The war between the enhanced and the uninfected reached its most brutal stage. The world had become a battlefield, a fractured place where the lines between right and wrong were no longer clear. The cities were in ruins, governments had collapsed, and civilization, as it had once been known, seemed like a distant memory. The once glorious human race was now divided into two factions, each fighting for control of the future. Kale, the leader of the Enhanced, stood tall in the midst of it all, his powers growing with every passing day. But a part of him knew that the war could not go on forever. The bloodshed, the destruction, it was wearing on him. Despite his unyielding desire to lead the Enhanced into a new era, he was beginning to see that even strength and power had their limits. In the aftermath of the battle that had decimated the old world order, Kale sat alone in his command center, looking out over the ruined city. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. The Enhanced had won, but at what cost? Thousands of uninfected men, women, and children had been killed in the attack, and though the old world order had been broken, the remnants of their resistance were still out there. They would continue to fight, just as the Enhanced had. And while Kale had envisioned a new world order, one where the Enhanced ruled with their abilities, he was beginning to wonder if that was truly the future he wanted. For the first time since the virus had begun to spread, Kale found himself questioning his beliefs. Was it right to force the uninfected into submission? Was it right to wield the power he had so freely, knowing the destruction it caused? The Enhanced were not just fighting for their survival, they were fighting to reshape the world, to make themselves the masters of a new era. But Kale was no longer certain that domination was the answer. He had seen the way the uninfected had adapted, how they had found new ways to fight back. They were no longer helpless, no longer simply the victims of a virus. They were evolving too. Dr. Voss, who had been monitoring the conflict from a distance, found herself in a similar position. She had spent years studying the virus, hoping to unlock its potential for the betterment of humanity. But now, as she saw the destruction that had been wrought by the war, she realized that the virus was a double-edged sword. It had given humanity the potential to evolve, to become something greater, but it had also brought out the worst in them. The Enhanced, once hopeful symbols of progress, had become warriors in a brutal conflict, and the uninfected were no longer the helpless, defenseless people they once were. They had become enemies. Enemies who fought for their survival, just as the Enhanced did. Dr. Voss knew that the only way to end the war was for both sides to find a way to coexist. The virus had unlocked something deep within humanity, a power that could either unite or destroy them. But the question was, could they ever come to terms with their differences? Could the Enhanced and the uninfected find a way to live together, or would the war continue until there was nothing left to fight for? As Kale sat in his command center, contemplating the future, a message came through from his closest advisors. The old world order had not been completely defeated. Resistance movements were still growing, and the uninfected were rallying together in a last-ditch effort to reclaim their world. Kale's heart sank. He had hoped that the battle was over, that his vision of a new world order could finally begin to take shape. But now, it seemed that the war was far from finished. The uninfected were not going to give up. They would continue to resist, to fight for their survival, and Kale knew that he couldn't continue to lead the Enhanced in this never-ending cycle of destruction. The war had reached a turning point. The Enhanced had the power to crush the resistance, but Kale began to question whether that was the right path. He understood that the future could be one of unity, a future where both the Enhanced and the uninfected could coexist, but it would require sacrifice from both sides. There would be no easy victory, no simple resolution. The question was whether humanity could evolve into something greater without destroying itself in the process. In a final attempt to bring about peace, Kale called for a summit, a meeting between the leaders of the Enhanced and the uninfected resistance. It was a bold move, one that would either result in the end of the war or in an even greater conflict. Dr. Voss, who had been advocating for peace all along, supported the idea, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. The scars of war ran deep, and the hatred between the two sides was almost insurmountable. Still, there was hope that the virus, which had torn the world apart, could also bring it back together. As the summit drew near, tensions were at an all-time high. Both sides were preparing for the worst. Kale, knowing that this meeting would either bring about a new dawn for humanity or lead to its complete destruction, felt a weight on his shoulders that he had never experienced before. He had spent so much time focusing on power, on strength, but now he saw that true leadership required more than just the ability to command. It required the wisdom to know when to fight and when to compromise. The summit began in a tense silence, the representatives of the enhanced and the uninfected sitting across from one another. Dr. Voss, acting as mediator, opened the discussion, calling for peace. The talks were difficult. There was deep mistrust on both sides, and it seemed as though every word, every gesture, was being scrutinized. The enhanced wanted recognition, power, and the assurance that they would not be oppressed by the uninfected. The uninfected, in turn, wanted their right to live freely, without the fear of being ruled by those who saw them as inferior. Hours passed, and it seemed as though no progress was being made. But just as the meeting was about to break down, something unexpected happened. Kale, who had been listening quietly, stood up. He didn't speak at first, but his presence commanded attention. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady, yet full of emotion. "We have all suffered," he said. "We've all lost something. Family, friends, our homes, our way of life. But we are not so different. We have the power to reshape the world, to create something better than what we had before. But that can only happen if we are willing to work together. I am not asking for submission. I am asking for cooperation, for a future where we do not fight to survive, but fight to build something new." His words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of hope. The enhanced and the uninfected were not so different. They had both been changed by the virus, but they had also both been given the opportunity to evolve. The question was no longer whether they would survive, but whether they would evolve together or continue to tear each other apart. The summit ended with no concrete agreements, but it had sparked something. A sense of possibility that had been lost in the chaos of war. It was not the end of the conflict, but it was the beginning of a new chapter. The road to peace would be long, and it would require sacrifices from both sides, but it was a road worth traveling. As Kale looked out over the room, he realized that the future was uncertain. The enhanced had the power, but the uninfected had the will. The virus had changed everything, and now it was up to humanity to decide what they would do with the power they had been given. The battle for the future was far from over, but for the first time, there was a chance for peace. And with that, Kale stepped forward, ready to lead humanity into whatever future awaited them, together.